Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. With the war continuing and only seeming to escalate on multiple fronts, it's naturally going to be hard to pull away from the news. But that is exactly what we are going to try to do on today's episode. On Wednesday night, Rosh Hashana begins. It's a new Jewish year, and it's essentially a time for renewal. We can take pause and look back and reflect on what was this past year, with all the bad and some of the good, and also look to the future. Who do we want to be personally? And what type of state and Jewish people do we want to have collectively? On a personal level, there's always going to be questions of faith, our relationship with God, and the tough questions. For example, where was God on October 7th? Where is God now as 101 people remain in Hamas captivity, in some dark tunnel somewhere in the Gaza Strip? I obviously don't have any answers, but I did have the opportunity to talk to someone who I think can help give us some understanding. I could read Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's bio, and it would probably fill up half a podcast. He's the president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life, a senior scholar in residence at Hadar, but that's what he is right now. He was a pioneer in the development of Holocaust education and commemoration. I could keep on going with different titles and organizations that he founded and established and led. But let me just say that he's a thinker, an educator, an author, and a true Jewish leader. I'd also like to think that I can call him and his wife Blue personal friends. I spoke with Rabbi Greenberg on the occasion of the publication of his new book, A Triumph of Life, a narrative theology of Judaism, which, as one writer called it, is his magnum opus and culmination of a lifetime of theological reflection. Rabbi Greenberg and I talk about belief in God, the Jewish people's role on this planet. Of course, we can't avoid a bit of talk about the war, as well as where the national religious movement in Israel has gone politically. I strongly recommend you have a listen. Rabbi Greenberg, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you, and we're speaking just before the new year, Rosh Hashana, and on the occasion, not just, always an amazing opportunity to hear your thoughts and your analysis and your understanding of everything that's happening to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. But you also were marking the publication of your new book, The Triumph of Life, a narrative theology of Judaism. And I'll just say off the top, there's different, I've been reading different descriptions of the book, whether it's people who claim that, it's the magnum opus, of course, but then there were people who talked about it as a culmination. I think it was Rabbi Shai Held, the president and dean at Hadar, where you've long been the senior scholar in residence, calling it, I quote, a culmination of a lifetime of theological reflection. So this is a important book, an interesting book. I've had the opportunity to read almost half of it by now. But what I found to be really interesting is the way you describe, to a large extent, the three eras that the Jewish people have lived in. And I'd love for you to describe that to us and to the listeners, because I think, like a lot of people, and personally myself, everyone grapples with faith, right? Everyone struggles with belief in God, whether you are a believer, you were once a believer, maybe one day you'll be a believer. But it's something that even to the people, who the atheists out there, or even the most strident of devout observers of any religion, it's something that everyone grapples with and everyone's always struggling with. But you put it into a very interesting context of how we might not see God, but he, or whatever it is always there. So I'm curious, give us explain to us the three eras, if you can.
Well, on one foot, Judaism's impact, the whole religious Jewish people and religious impact on the world, the single most influential point is bringing the world the attention or the feeling or the experience of the presence of God. That's number one. Actually, my book covers even item number two. The second greatest impact was our Messianic teaching that the whole world as it is now even though it's God's creation, needs to be redeemed, perfected. It needs to be repaired. And the Jewish claim is that, in fact, we will and can, we should repair that world. It's a partnership. It will take a covenant or a partnership between God and Jews, God and humanity, actually, to do that. Those are the two most influential Jewish ideas. Don't accept the status quo. Transform this world into a world that really should be a paradise, a Gan Eden, for everybody. Those are the two main thoughts. Now, how does that connect to the 3-year idea? My claim is that in this idea of God approaching humans, recruiting humans, in this case, the Jewish people, to join in this partnership to repair the world, we all think of it, of course, as Sinai, the Torah given at Sinai. But my argument is that it's really happened 3 times, meaning we've had 3 different stages of this relationship and this connection between God and Israel and between God and the world. In the first period, which we now call biblical Judaism, God is very much the dominant partner. So when the Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt, they've given up. They have no strength, no resistance. God sends Moses. God sends miracles. God smashes the Egyptian army. The very much controlling, dominant partner who gets the Jews to do what they have to do, but it's basically following orders, or even more strongly in the Bible, if you listen to God, God will take care. God will drown the Egyptian army. God will destroy Midian when they are oppressors of the Jews 500 years later. If you stay on God's side, if you worship God, if you obey God, and so on. If you don't, then God sends the punishment, Babylonians, Assyrians, who destroy the Jewish people. Now, my claim is, and this is the great rabbinic contribution, the rabbis, primarily because of the destruction of the temple, but they started teaching before. They said the God, the universal, all-powerful God, self-limited. The first self-limited was just to enter into partnership and say, I won't do everything, you've got to do your share. We've now living through a second limitation. How does it show? God no longer appears visibly. You don't see fires on the mountain. You don't see bolts from heaven, all those kinds of visible miracles anymore, because God is hidden. Now, you may think God hidden means that God is not present. It's just the opposite, said the rabbis. The God who is dominant, controlling, if you got too close, if you saw God, you dropped dead. If you touched the Aron, you'd be electrocuted, and so on. So God is self-limited to come closer. The self-limitation is expressed that God is hidden. We're now living in a world, you don't see a manifestation literally of God anymore. There's no physical manifestation. But God is now presented in the rabbis as Shana, not the male, all-powerful warrior God. It's God, the loving, motherly, maternal, caring, close, who, and this is the beauty of it, hidden, but present much more and much closer to you. If you, in your kitchen, instead of going to the temple to have a sacrifice, if you're kosher, if you make a meal with reverence for life, God is present. You make a
It's
bracha.
more in that rabbinic period.
Correct.
It's more in the human action. It starts to translate. You tell the story in the book also. You bring as just one example the story of Rosh Hashana, right? The oven, and lo b'shamayim he, right? It's not coming from heaven. It's now our decision, us as people, and through that is the manifestation of God.
What that story in the Talmud tells is that no longer will you hear a voice from heaven, or for that matter, a prophet will come and say, "Thus saith the Lord, do this." It's over. But in the contrary, God has called humans to step up. The rabbis are the leaders of this. Step up and say, you want to know what God wants? You figure it out with your brain. You will study the past revelation, but you'll apply it in your time. So the rabbis tell us that God became closer, more present everywhere. And they show us, the rabbis say, if you make love in your bedroom, if you make love in a spirit that's truly loving and respectful of the person, Shekhinah is present, God is present. If you sit at a meal and you talk words of Torah, if you visit the sick at the hospital, there is Shekhinah right at the head of the bed. So number one is much more present, much more human responsibility to make it happen. Now here's what I'm claiming. This is the original, if I can say, in the third stage. I believe it's now a couple of hundred years since the stage began. In fact, I think modernity, which is the whole world's response, not just the Jewish response to this self-limitation. God self-limits again. What does that mean? Number one, God is totally hidden. We're living in a world really you don't see, even invisible miracles, you don't see them in that way anymore. And in fact, that's what misleads. And people but what's really happening? This totally hidden God is saying, again, I'm doing it not to be remote. I'm coming closer. I'll be everywhere. But humans have to take full responsibility. This partnership is not over, but you have to take full responsibility. Everything that will outcome in history will depend on your behavior, your limitations and your failures, or your good sense. So in the third period, this is the paradox. God is totally hidden, but totally present. Only we have to uncover that present. And therefore, and this is my argument in the book, the hidden God, well, if you are a businessman who creates a business that hires people, that respects them, pays them a living wage, overcomes poverty, it's one of the main enemies of life is poverty, then you can, bring this world closer to the perfection. You're part of the Tikkun Olam, so to speak. At the same time, there you will find God. If you will, looking out for the vulnerable, and if you open up your mind and heart, you will find God among the afflicted, among the vulnerable, among those who need help.
So I remember a conversation that you and I had maybe about a year ago. You were working on the book, but I was talking to, I think it was over a Shabbat meal that I had the privilege to join you at. And we were talking about people with cancer as an example. And I think I shared with you how when I went through a personal experience, to me, it was a crisis of faith, right? How can a child suffer such great disease and such illness? But you actually said to me something interesting, which is, because I said, where's God? But your answer to some extent, and I'm paraphrasing here, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, was what about the medicine? What the treatment, obviously. That is the manifestation. And you even broadened it to be about technology. When we look at our phones, when we look at everything that we have that surrounds us, that makes the world a better place, that is to some extent the manifestation, if that's the right word, or the illustration, or that is the presence of God in this hidden form within us. Can you explain what that means?
No, I think, see, a lot of people are still hung up on the image of the relationship to God that is dominant in the biblical period. You listen to God, it'll rain. You don't listen to God, no rain, agricultural disaster. So frankly, in that context, people said, if I'm sick with cancer, I must have done something wrong. What did I do wrong? Or why is God out to get me? So that is the understanding of the past, but it doesn't understand relationship to God as we now understand it, thanks to the rabbis and beyond. What is what? This is an age where God is known and present in the natural law, in the process, literally the natural law. In other words, the stability we don't fall apart every 30 seconds. The world, the sun rises. And in this age, when God is present in natural law, there are more miracles than ever before in history. And I agree. I think an iPhone is a miracle. You speak here and 7,000 miles away, they hear you. But the greatest miracles, and perhaps the most significant, are the medical miracles we're living through. Now, how did I get cancer? Not because God is angry at me and not because I did something wrong. I got cancer because a gene went off, because a particular mechanism supposed to control the growth breaks down and the cell starts replicating wildly and killing fatally. So now we need a miracle. But the miracle is not the doctor saying, God, zap this cancer tumor for me. The miracle is that the doctor, as God's agent, we are the agents of God in this partnership, saying, studying the natural law and figuring out what medicine, what chemical that God has placed in this, what looks to be penicillin, look like a mold. It turns out to have antibiotic powers. Look at this particular medicine, which has the power to burn, kill, destroy the cancer cell. And so the miracle is that God has created these powers. And the second miracle is God's agent uncovering it. So the doctor prays to God. He's not praying to God to zap it doesn't happen. And that's why I argue Those who go to the Rebbe for blessing, good, God bless them. But there's no statistical indication that a Rebbe's blessing will cure your cancer when a doctor's can't. It's part of the religious illusion,
Right.
and I understand. But the more important thing is if the doctor prays to God, open my mind, let me notice this anomaly, let me pick up this particular side effect that has the power to uncover and to save. And yes, I think doctors are making miracles every day. And you've had experience, we've had that experience of a child saved by miraculous medical intervention. We've also had the experience where it didn't work. So I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but it's a whole different understanding of the relationship to God.
For sure.
And what is and how do we do God's purposes? And my answer again is a doctor who was inspired not only to come up with the treatment, but to get up early in the morning and make a home call. To the doctor who really took the extra time and mind and effort to figure out what is the cause, what's the genetic and particular issue. That doctor is God's agent and is doing God's miracles for us.
But I want to, I mean, like, let's pretend for a moment that we can talk to God. I mean, we can, like, through prayer and others, but let's say we could actually engage God. And one of the questions I would say to him, based on your book, is where did you go? In other words, back in the biblical period, you were omnipresent, right? You showed me your existence all the time, whether it was through smoke and lightning or Har Sinai or whatever it was. But I knew the plagues and the miracles were so obvious that these were God created. And then, fine, even the rabbinic period, to some extent, it started to change, and that was the beginning of what you also refer to as the tzimtzum, right? It's like the minimization,
self-limitation of God,
right? Limitation of God's presence, but it was still there to some extent, because even in that story of Achnai's oven, there still is the bat kol, right? There's still the voice from heaven that still comes down, but for whatever they decide to ignore it. But nowadays, completely hidden. Like, why wouldn't, if you were God's advisor, Rabbi Greenberg, right? Would you not say to him, show yourself, right? It will solve so many problems, right? Why would God's strategy be this?
So yeah, sometimes I think the same way. I wish Hashem would listen to me. I'd give a much better way of doing these things. But again, but my answer is, I think in the end, it has to do with the maturation, God's dream of human beings, not puppets, and not even well-trained dogs who are grateful when you feed them every day, and so they kiss you and they love you. God's dream is human beings growing up. And I have a big chapter in the book on this called the human being in the image of God. God wants human beings not only to have what I argue in the book is the dignities of being an image of God, infinitely valuable beyond any amount of money, or equal. All images of God are equal, white, black, male, female, and unique. Each one is the only one of their kind in history and in the world. God wants to, even more important, God wants us to become more God-like, to become more conscious and understanding of the universe, to become more emotionally relationship loving, like God is tova Shana, God loves all people. The rachamav, God's mother love is for all God's creatures. So God wants us to grow up. So yes, as children in the first stage of this religion, God was visible, and God gave you candy after you did the good things, and gave you a little potch if you sometimes did the wrong thing. But as you grow up, and that's the beauty again of the tradition, as you grow up, it tells you more and it calls upon you more. So in the second stage already, in the ethics of the fathers, the rabbi famous line, don't serve God like a servant who wants to be rewarded. Serve God as not wanting to be rewarded for the sake of the... So that's part of growing up. Part of growing up is to see God who is hidden, but much more present. What did the rabbis do with the bracha? They said, look, you were eating this apple. But if you think about it for a minute, you realize this apple was part of God's creation. And God who runs the system that has water and the tree and all the miracles of seeding. And if you at this moment are conscious of that, you make a bracha. Bless you, God. You created this fruit of the tree. You created this potato, fruit of the ground. So already you have a maturation And you're doing it much less for payoff and much more because you want to appreciate, because relation to God is much deeper. Now I come to the third stage, and that to me is, what's the most mature, fully responsible person? At that point, the answer is, I don't have to do it for you. That's my dream of every parent. And my child will grow up and do, not because I remind them, because I punish them, because I reward them. They do it because they learned the example from me, because they love me and they want to walk in my footsteps, because they've fallen in love with the vision of a perfect world and they want to make it happen, because so that is the third stage. Now, the good news of that, again, is I think it means that human beings are in a more noble and a more responsible relationship to God and everything else. What's the bad news? Well, the bad news in part is that God is hidden. And therefore, if you don't see, if you don't look, or sometimes if you don't have the right experience, you are tempted to go the other way and give up or say there's nothing there. Or again, this is the abuse version. The secular or the evil people, like the Nazis, who in effect feel they don't see God sending lightning bolts to kill people who are bad. So what do? So they feel they're correctly, they are free. The main theme of the third era is power. Humans take power as never before. God wants us to take power, but God wants us to use the power for life. The Nazis used it for death. And it's a good example to me. That's crucial to the whole book. Why, again, I don't get me wrong. I have never gotten over, and I have not ever forgiven totally. Why didn't God step in and do his biblical era, split the sea and drown the Nazis? I can't get over that, but I live with it. But if I understand in the third era, God really said, you have to do it. Human power, I'm giving complete freedom to human power, but you have to exercise it. What happened in the Holocaust, this is a tragedy. The Jews were powerless. They didn't have a state, or an army to protect them, or a place to go for haven. The Allies who had power could have stopped the Germans. They eventually did stop the Germans, but they didn't use it to save the Jews.
Right.
Where they did, by the way, they did save Jews in Denmark, in Bulgaria. They saved Jews because they literally used their power to save them. Now, the other tragedy is that the neighbors, in places like Poland and Lithuania, the neighbors overwhelmingly helped the Nazis. And so the end, all the power was on the side of death. And to me, this is our tragedy. And this is the tragedy of the Haredim and of the Orthodox pre-Holocaust. The majority said, no, you can't go build Israel. You can't create a state. You have to wait for the Messiah. Well, that Messiah, in my judgment, if it didn't come in the Holocaust, is unfit. Either is it never going to come, or is unfit to come. Ali Wiesel once wrote this, and we discussed, he said, if there was a real miraculous Messiah who could have simply stepped in and defeated evil and saved them, then there was no other time that was more likely and more necessary than the Holocaust. If it didn't come, he said, if he'd come now, I would despise him. What kind of Messiah? You could have done this and you didn't. Forgive me. I'd rather go. I'm not willing to follow. But so what a Messiah who couldn't come because the world wasn't ready, because the Messiah doesn't have miracle powers, but rather is going to work with human beings to make a better world. That Messiah we can bring. That's our responsibility. And the whole Jewish people woke up and understood after the Shoah that we have to take power. That's the great calling of this era. We have to take power. And so they became Zionists. They built a state. Again, of course,
that's taking the power. And you refer to in the book of also this being the covenant today, essentially, is the action that we take as people. That is the relationship or the covenant with God. And you
that's
also
what we should understand.
That should be what we should strive for.
It's tragic to me that the religious authorities like the chief rabbinate and the Haredi in general still don't understand this. And the claim that I'm protecting Israel by learning Torah and God will protect Israel because I'm learning Torah, and therefore I'm exempt from the draft. That's a classic example of how an idea that's not true anymore, may have been true. It's not true anymore. And they should have learned it the most. The most people, the highest percentage of people who died in the Shoah were Haredim, because they had no culture, they had no protection, they had no, okay. But to say this now, to me, it's classic. you're in the name of, you're not doing what you should be doing anyway. When I come back to the covenant, so my answer is that the so-called secularists who understood they have to go back and build Israel, the secularists who give their lives, the religious Zionists who give their lives, they're the people who are listening to God and taking responsibility to the point of noble self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Look at the deaths, look at the suffering, but it's a statement of love of God. And for those who don't believe in God, my point is, it's a statement of love of the vision of the Torah. And you know, there's a famous medrash that Talmud that God says, I don't care if they forget me as long as they follow my Torah or carry my vision. And I think that, so I would argue that the true partners, the true fillers of the covenant are not the people who officially, or who claim that their ritual performance proves that they're the most religious. It's the opposite. It's the people who carry out the call of the covenant
Through the action, right?
Through the action.
And you talk a lot about in the book is also because of the action and the shared values that are the manifestation of this covenant of God is also Tikkun Olam, right? And is fighting the central problems that we face in humanity, whether it's poverty, hunger, right, starvation, helping other people,
sickness, war, absolutely,
sickness and war, of course. But so the one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading, the mentioning of Tikkun Olam to a lot of people today, obviously has this political connotation, and that's where I tend to go, but very much associated with Reform Judaism, liberal, progressive movements and streams within Judaism, much less with the Orthodox or the modern Orthodox, a world where you come from. And I'm curious how the reception has been because I mean, what you're basically advocating for, it's not crazy, right? It's saying we as a people in our service of God is to make the world a better place, right? Is to help our fellow people, our fellow human beings. But still there is that political context, which is hard to ignore. So I'm just curious what that reception has been like and whether you were thinking of that when you were advocating it in the book.
Well, first of all, you caught me red-handed that I deliberately chose that to be provocative and challenging because I felt too many people around me were saying just that we're yes, Messiah, Tikkun Olam, it's all about saving the Jewish people. And there is a legitimate and very strong tradition that it's only for the Jewish people. But to me, the classic text of the value of life and the most moral responsibility is the famous Talmudic statement, if you save one life, it's like saving a whole world. And that's why I come with the argument, this means that each life is infinitely valued. If you save one life, you saved an infinity. Well, if you save the whole world of 8 billion people, it's also infinity. That's what the Talmud's trying to say. But along comes the Jewish experience, and I don't want to make light of it. Suffering, persecution, where the Gentiles really not only put them in a ghetto, they tortured them, they expelled them. So in the later text, not in the original text of the Mishnah, they wrote in, whoever saves one Jewish life, saves the whole world. And the truth is that's the most widespread version of Vilna Ram, which is reproduced in most 90% of the Talmud. It says saving one Jewish life. The same idea with Tikkun Olam. They're trying to say Tikkun Olam means saving the Jews, fighting for the Jews. My answer is the way we save Jews and fight for the Jews is absolutely central to Tikkun Olam. But it's our contribution. It's our model, and the Messianic vision is not just the Jews, it's the whole world. So either we directly help the world or we show an example. Both. Yes, there are people who use Tikkun Olam to say, I bleed for the whole world, and I ignore, or I neglect, or I'm ignorant of my Jewish background. That's a danger. I understand that. But I think it's an equal great danger to be so Jewish that it's totally the circle of Jews. I don't care. I don't care about anybody else. And as far as I'm concerned, they can all go to hell, or I don't care if they're all suffering. That's the wrong understanding. So yes, so I use Tikkun Olam in part to be provocative, and in part to argue a broader issue, which is that the Messianic vision of Judaism, that life wins out totally, is the ultimate Jewish calling. In other words, Isaiah's version, Bila hamavat lanetza. Literally, we will overcome not only the enemies of life are poverty, hunger, sickness, war, anything that degrades life or degrades human dignity. Right? Alzheimer's is a degradation of human uniqueness, and so on. War kills precious infinitely valuable human lives. All these things are the enemies. We do have to overcome them. We will work on them. That's our claim. But our vision is to the point where we'll literally overcome death. We'll literally, now that may sound extreme. And so I tell people, if you really feel upset by this, it's too extreme, I will come back to, I'll give you a compromised version. Isaiah in chapter 25 says we'll overcome death completely. In 65, he softens that a little and says, look, life will be so extended that when someone dies at 100 years old, they'll say, he's just a kid. He's just a kid. Now, again, that may sound, frankly, we're living through that. In the last 200 years, the average human life expectancy has gone from the upper 30s to the upper 70s. So now I come back to the Messianic vision. What I'm trying to say is that the Messianic vision is for everybody, and that we, as a generation, have a real chance to make a major contribution. That's the whole point of covenant. We'll do as much as we can. The next generation will do the next amount. So the Messianic idea is central. It should not be pushed aside. That having been said, and we take power to achieve it. That having been said, bluntly, there are messianists in our midst who really abuse this idea and take it into I consider it both a dangerous and destructive path. So I'm speaking messianism, but with restraint. In general, Israel's greatness as an army, as a power, is a major achievement of the covenant, but the test of a covenantal power is to use it with restraint, with respect for life, to use it to advance the life, improve the world.
So I want to ask you about that, because obviously we're talking as we're still here in Israel in the middle of a war. You've been in, you were spending part of your time in New York, part of your time in Israel, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been here since October 7th, and you were here on October 7th during the Chagim then, and we're coming up on the first anniversary of the Hamas massacre that day. And Israel still is in war, and things are escalating in the north. So on the one hand, we have the war in its entirety. And then, of course, there's the personal aspect of war. For you, you have grandchildren who have been in fighting. You have grandchildren who are still in the army. You have one grandson who was seriously injured in the war, is still recovering, is still undergoing treatments and to get better. And I happened to see him not long ago. What a hero, what bravery and courage and resilience. It's mind-blowing. But and that's one story. That's your personal story. It's a story that thousands and tens of thousands of people across this country are dealing with on a daily basis. And this the struggle, or this book that also talks about faith, we go back and we talk about the Holocaust, but to some people, they're looking at this happening right now. They're looking at the challenges today in October, right, in September. And the question is, Rabbi Greenberg, I mean, how do we, where does it get better? Is there a better for us? And is Israel really also, when you talk about the manifestation of this covenant of making the world a better place, of that Tikkun Olam, we're embroiled in conflict. Is it even possible to break away from that?
Yeah, again, these are all hard questions. And of course, the real answer is not my words or yours, but how the Jewish people is actually acting. So we should go in order. October 7th, we made Aliyah about 5 years ago, thinking we go back and forth, but since COVID and so on, I've been back in the United States just once for a couple of weeks. So we've been overwhelmingly here in Israel. Yes, so we were present October 7th, and present the year before when the threat to judicial independence raised the crisis, will this country remain a democracy? I mean, so again, when I speak of God giving us freedom and power, it also means that God is taking a chance. It's a risk. Yeah. If we misuse that power, we could do the opposite what God wants. And that's part of the challenge here. So to go in order, the catastrophic massacre and raping and so on October 7th was a tremendous shock. And even more equal shock that after it, a large part of the world support Hamas or justified it or hid what they did, and anti-Semitism spread. This is very shocking. But I come back to my main point. It's not the Holocaust. And we know why. Because in the Holocaust, This happened day after day for 6 years. That's why 6 million died.
And we didn't have the ability to defend and fight back, which we now have.
In this case, after one day, again, a tragic and awful day, where 1,200 people died and were killed and massacred and tortured. But within one day, the IDF wiped out 90% of those actual terrorists who had come into Israel and were fighting back. And so, number one, that's changed. Again, it's my answer, because the Jews who understand the covenant took power, and they've created one of the greatest, most powerful armies in the world. And that's what our religious calling is supposed to be about. And that's where we should be serving as religious Jews. So that's step one. Frankly, I think, so in a certain sense, what people are overreacting by saying, Zionism failed. After all, it could kill Jews like in the Holocaust. So what have we accomplished? The answer is, we've accomplished that it's a process that will not happen without resistance, that it can be stopped. And that's the second step. The war against Hamas was the correct response of a free people that has the choice and the obligation to defend life and to defend itself. And Hamas, keep in mind, is pledged not only to kill all the Israelis. In their charter, they dream of this surah that says that every Jew, last Jew in the world, will be killed by Muslims. So that's our task, and evil must be stopped. And yes, it's something we fulfill at the cost of lives and the children's suffering and their lives. And there is no greater sacrifice, but this is the heroism. I always tell people, we are living in the heroic age of the Jewish people. And to take power, we're prepared to do whatever necessary, including sacrifices. And including the ultimate sacrifices of lives of our children is the hardest. So that is part of our picture right now. And my answer is, did we exercise this power with moral restraint? And here again, my answer is yes. It's very tragic, and I think that more Israelis should be conscious of it. It's very tragic that there are 40,000 Palestinian deaths. It's very heartbreaking that many of them, thousands, are children and women, civilians. But having said that, the test of a moral army, every army kills civilians. It's inescapable if you're in a war. The real test of moral army is, do you make an effort to keep those ratios down and to kill as few civilians as possible? It's doubly hard when you have Hamas and other terrorists plant their people inside the people as human shields, inside schools, mosques, right, hospitals. IDF has done this. If you look at a very simple statistic, of the 40,000, something like 18 or 19,000 are fighters. That means the ratio of civilian deaths is 1-to-1 or 1.2-to-1. It's an unbelievable ratio.
Unprecedented in military history, without a doubt.
Unprecedented. In Afghanistan, they announced they have to win back the population support against Taliban. So they called upon all the commanders, all the soldiers, to go all out to avoid civilian casualties. They worked at it. They held people responsible. And you know what? They got it down to 3 or 4 civilians to 1. To bring it down to 1.2 is an unbelievable self-restraint and challenge. So that's my second comment, is living up to. Now, having said that, it's also true, and I blame the government for this, because of the presence of extremists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. When Israel, for example, saw, the prime minister should have every day said, today, 300 Palestinian civilians or 400 children died. And we're heartbroken. And we are trying our best. And the truth is, we canceled X amount of missions. We did all kinds of things to avoid. Instead of saying that, why not? Because he had these extremists in his government who wanted to hear about Palestinian casualties, who felt that they should be saying hateful things. So he couldn't say it. But in the world, what did that look like? Now I come to the second. They saw that there's going to be a food shortage in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And they started sending in food for 2 weeks before they said it publicly. They didn't say it publicly. Why? Again, because of Smotrich and Gvir would be angry and might even walk out. So they didn't say it. Then 2 weeks later, when America and the international community began to say hunger, and in fact, they charged Israel practicing starvation, then they admitted publicly. So instead of getting the credit, what other nation has done this to send in food and humanitarian aid against an enemy out to destroy them? And to the civilian
I say to
population,
people all the time, can you imagine after 9/11 when bin Laden was in the Tora Bora Mountains
right,
and was hiding out, that George
the,
W. Bush's administration would have sent them fuel so their generators can pump oxygen into those mountains? Of course not.
of
But I mean,
course,
that also has to do with the double standard. But
no,
I mean,
but my
yeah,
point is, we should have gotten the credit for that, and Israel's image as a moral country would be much clearer. Again, there's lots of people who are saying vicious and untrue things, but this could have been a lot better. I blame our government, and frankly, our prime minister in particular, for silence based on the fact of his political survival. It's outrageous, and this war has cost Israel much respect and much moral standing. And again, it's not just an intellectual or even a moral issue, it's a security issue. The key has been American support, American unbelievable support. But the key there is that the bulk of Americans are doing it not because of AIPAC, with all due respect, and not because of all the Jewish, which is also important, but because they think Israel is a moral, democratic, human, decent place. And these people who have undermined that particular, or who allow settlers to riot and kill and hurt Palestinians, breaking the law, they are not only violating Jewish values and Jewish laws, they are also undermining Israel's very standing and security in the world.
so you have long been one of the most vocal and outspoken leaders of modern Orthodoxy in the United States for decades. And in Israel, at least, when we look at the national, people would look at the kippah on your head and they would say, oh, here's a national religious
Right.
person, a dati leumi, right? Beyond, forget about what he might think or what he's written, just looking at you with the kippah that you wear. And the people who supposed are the representatives of the dati leumi sector of society, whether it's Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and some of the people in their party, you've long been a critic in columns that you've written in the Jerusalem Post and other places of how they have hijacked to some extent the values of what modern Orthodoxy is meant to be. Because on the one hand, and I'll say it like this also, when you look at the casualties, by the way, in Gaza, in the IDF, already surpassing 700 since October 7. Many of them, I don't know what the numbers are right now, but at one point you were talking about more than 50% were people who either were Dati or came from Dati families and went through Dati schooling and institutions. You see a predominant, it's no secret anymore in the IDF. You look at brigades, commanders, you look at the general staff today, so many people who are coming from that community, those schools, those yeshivot, those high schools, etc. Some of them are voters of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, right? So they are fighting. They are, to an extent, they are the manifestation of what you talk about in your book, which is the action. This is the covenant today with God. But on the other hand, their leaders, at least, the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, you would not think that they are being fulfilling what that divine relationship is meant to be with their actions and with their remarks. So break that down for me if you can.
That's a very painful point you made. You once very smartly said to me, you're much harsher on them than almost anybody else you write about. How come? So the answer, of course, is what you just said. The answer is because it's my community, and they're using the religion that I deeply love and believe in, but they're using it in a way that I think leads to evil or these destructive and hostile outcomes, racism and so on. So in a way, I'm speaking out of frustration when I criticize them. Why? Because on the one hand, the religion, this is our religion, should be such a powerful resource, not just for religious Jews, for the whole community. In other words, because we're living in a country where we have to fight for our very existence, because it's been much more difficult than a normal country, people deserve and need some reinforcement, some sense that there's a purpose, there's a higher force behind you, that there's a historical calling you're fulfilling, and so on. People need that. The religion should be therefore a source of not only inspiration, which it is for those who go to the army and give their lives, it should be a source of inspiration for everybody, that you are not alone, that you are carrying on a noble and millennial-long tradition, you are fighting for life and for repair of the world. instead of getting that, people like Maturation and Gvir, and for that matter, the official rabbinate, has turned this into a very narrow, as if God only cares about them or the few Jews who keep exactly the Torah the way they believe in it. And so I find it very disturbing because it's a misuse. The Torah, which is meant to be a Torah's Chaim of life, of Chesed, Tzedakah. I read a piece in the Shabbat, one of these Shabbat weekend flyers called Emes Ahava. It's called Faith, Emunah V'Ahava, Faith and Love. And this rabbi is a leading Rosh Hashana, writes in there that about Amalek, he said, this was a few parshas ago, it says the Jews fought with the Canaanim and they wiped them out. So he says, if the Medrash says it wasn't the Canaanim, it was Amalek, but they talked like Canaanim. In other words, they talked softly, they hid their evil intention, but they were Amalek, and that's why in the end they killed them all, men, women, and children. He said, we're living in our time. These people are Amalek. They talk like Canaani so they could lower our guard and get the world to back them. But they're all Amalek, and we should wipe them out to the last man, woman, and child. So my reaction, I want to write a letter saying, I see the faith, but where's the love? I mean, in other words, you get so carried away. So to come back to the main point, I really believe that the religion also needs to be liberated. And its qualities of life affirmation, love, I've tried to show in the book. It's not a casual thing. The halakha is an attempt to take every action of life and make it loving, life-affirming. It's a major challenge to do that. And instead, they have taken it and tried to make it a law that justifies killing children, even innocent children. They try to make it to something that says, be so full of anger and hatred of the Arabs that you're perfectly content to have people violate the law and break their rights and kill their sheep or even kill them individually.
I mean, I'll just even add to that, the politicization of religion has also just turns people away from what could be a beautiful religious and spiritual experience for so many Israelis who are just turned away from it.
Absolutely. Our task is to I feel I speak we now of those who are religious Zionists. Yes, there are times, frankly, I was tempted to take off my kippah to hide it. It reminds me, in the Nazis, there were Nazis who were religious, devout, and so on. The classic case of the Einsatzgruppen that shot men, women, and children day after day. It's a classic case when they were on trial in Nuremberg. It came out that they were shooting all the Jews in Simferopol in Crimea, and they hadn't finished. It was Erev Christmas, so the head said to them, it's very upsetting to hear the shooting on Christmas. So the prosecutor said, what'd you do? He said, well, we got up early in the morning, and we took out the last Jews, we shot them. We got back just in time for the Mass, so we were happy that we weren't going to disturb the Christmas spirit, by shooting, and they will be upset. Now, so when I read that, my reaction was, everybody who believes in God, every Christian, should hide it for 100 years till the murderers forget. Otherwise, they will use Christmas. So my point is the same thing here. There are times I'm tempted to say, take off the kippah so people shouldn't think that the Torah really is the Torah of hatred or racism. So it's a major challenge, and not small. But my main hope is, and I think we're seeing it now in the polls, and that the Religious Zionist Party particularly is in serious trouble electorally. I think because the voters who voted for the Religious Zionists see that they've ended up electing people who are extremists, who are supporting the Haredi draft exemption, who are not willing to make peace, who are not willing to save hostages, whatever the cost. And I hope that's the beginning of what is much more important. Ben Zusman, when I visited Shiva, his mother said to me, I hope that my child's sacrifice will not be in vain, that after the war we'll build a better Israel, a more responsible, a more moral, a more democratic Israel. That's my hope, that particularly in this community where there have been such heavy losses, that people will awake and say, do I have the right religious understanding? And can I now turn God forbid, the tragic loss of my child into something to spur to life? To me, it's also one of the great, amazing things. I come back to the question about how do I feel about October 7th? My answer is, in past history, after the Holocaust, the greatest assault of death on us and our dignity. The Jewish people created the state of Israel, the greatest outburst of life and of dignity of Jews in history. You know, Rabbi Vogelent at that time, he was the Secretary General of the Director General of the Chief Rabbinate. He did a study. 80% of the rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, full-time students of Talmud before the war lived in Eastern Europe, meaning that 30% of the Jewish people died, but 80% of the rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, full-time Talmud students were wiped out, 80%. Now, in response, the Jewish people created yeshivot, kolelim, to the point now there are more people studying Talmud full-time, and not just men, one of the great breakthroughs of our generation of women, full-time than ever before in Jewish history. So this is my dream for this moment, as tragic and as upsetting as it is, and as threatening as it is. To me, it's shocking that people can say this sincerely, and they're sincere. They don't know if Israel will survive. And God forbid, Iran, if it gets nuclear, is an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's very shocking to face that. But here is why I say we turn to God, not as the guarantee and not to do the work for us, but who promised that we're not only eternal people, who promised that it will not be in vain, the world will be repaired, there will have, all these things can come true if we do our share. And my prayer is that what Jewish people will do, again, it'll come through. There'll be an outburst of life. There'll be an outburst of love and responsibility. It hadn't happened yet, and we haven't had an election yet to throw out the rascals, but okay. But still, I really believe if you study Jewish history, this is coming. If you allow me one personal example of this,
Please.
Our youngest daughter, she's now 57, our youngest daughter, became a grandmother for the first time in her life about 6 weeks ago, twice in the same week. Her number one son and her number three son, number one had a son, number three had a daughter in the same week. Number two son is the one who was badly wounded in Gaza and who really, we understand, came to inches, and he's still not over it, and it's a major long-term cure process. It's already had 21 operations. I mean, thank God for Israeli medicine's miracles, but still. Anyway, so he was badly wounded. So after the Brits in celebration, I asked both sons, how come this coincidence within 1 week? You know what they said? Both said, independently, our family, my wife and I, were thinking seriously of starting our family, having children. Not just yesterday, the last year we've been thinking about it a lot. Then, October 7th, and then on December 7th, their brother was badly wounded, inches away from death. And so they looked at each other. They didn't look at each other, looked at their wives, right, and said, we can't.
And they both made the same decision.
They said, we can't wait. Whereas the only way Jews can respond is to have a child now. And
so the answer is life.
That's and luckily, the amazing thing about it, they both succeeded immediately. So they ended up with grandchildren the same week. But think again, to me, that's the Jewish people. And I really believe is the record that we should never give up on. That we should give us hope. It gives us incentive to try. It won't happen by itself. But that is the Jewish people, every time in history, when it has faced catastrophe or existential threat, it got up, got its act together, and it reasserted life. Because that, in fact, that's what the book argues. That's the main message of the Jewish religion. On a personal level, live your life on the side of life. Every act you do should be and can be on the side of life. Study it, figure it out, make it more life, more quality. But to me, that's what gives me hope right now and even optimism, because I think as shocked and as we're back on our heels, we're a little lost, we're a little threatened, we're a little depressed, and a lot depressed. But my answer is I believe sooner or later this Jewish tradition, value, belief, reality will kick in again and reassert that power. At least that the book is arguing.
Well, on that optimistic note, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to wish you and Blue and the entire family a Shana tova, and thank you for writing this book and sharing with us your thoughts and your optimism of what the Jewish people can do, what the state of Israel can do, and how we can achieve something that's better and greater. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us on today's podcast. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of myself, as well as all of us here at JPPI, to wish you a Shana tova, a happy new year. It should be sweet. You should find happiness, health, love in the year to come, one of safety and security for the Jewish people and for everyone, no matter who you are, where you come from, what your background is. You should have safety and security all over the world. Thank you very much, Shana tova, and we will see you next week.